with that, I'd like to formally open the Zoom chat to all the Q&A and conversation that we would like.
W4NUA, Chris. You mentioned the transatlantic communications. Is that the Marconi from St. John's, Newfoundland, over to England test that you're speaking of?
No, actually, that took place around 1901 or something. But what I'm talking about is the first amateur transmission across the Atlantic that took place in December of 1921. Prior to that, there were plenty of commercial operations doing this. Marconi, of course, was the earliest trailblazer, but no, I'm talking about the first amateur transmission, and it was one way only, by the way.
Sure. You said that was the first amateur transatlantic communication. How do you do a QSO without two-way communication?
Well, it wasn't a QSO. It was just the first transmission. So they were testing the way it operated in short. And you could read all the details on my website, by the way. Just look for the articles that start with the word crossings. They had this whole test set up where the league actually sent one of the U.S. hams over to Scotland to set up a special station. This guy was an expert in shortwave at the time, which not many people were. And they set up a station along the coast in Scotland and listened just every night for stations from North America. And that was the first reception of an amateur signal that crossed the Atlantic.
Yeah, that December transmission is kind of an odd twist on DX, right? So we sent the receiving station over to receive DX.
Well, another funny kind of a funny part of the story is that the previous months previously they had tried this and failed by not sending anybody over. They just relied on the British amateurs to receive, yeah. and then the league felt, well, we're going to send somebody over who really knows what he's doing. So they sent this rather famous amateur named Paul Godley, who had a company that made shortwave receivers over there to use as, he actually designed a receiver specifically for this purpose and took it over there, and, it worked.
Do you recall what the first message that he received was?
I don't remember exactly, but the way this worked was in order to ensure authenticity, what the league did was it sent over the messages that would be transmitted in a sealed envelope that would remain in a safe by the British hams organization until after the operation, and not even the operators on the transmitting side in the U.S. were not given those until the first night of operation. And of course, the receiving guys over in Scotland didn't have it at all. So there was a set of messages that they had to do. I don't remember what was the first.
Hey, Chris, Steve Koenig, KO4KGS, a fantastic history lesson. My question is really around antennas. If you could elaborate a little bit more on antennas, because I was shocked at your description of some of these early stations, and there was that particular cover of the naval operator on his ship, and then kind of hearkening back to 1917 with his QTH, and I noticed that it was just these very large arrays of antennas. And you also described how some of these early stations were in dense urban areas. So it really begs the question, what were their antennas set up? How were these architected?
Yeah, well, at this time, remember, CW hadn't quite come in yet. And in the very early days, the antenna was actually part of what determined the wavelength of operation. It was part of the circuit, right? There was even no tuned circuits really to get selective in the spark days. Okay, so these big antennas for spark operation were merely, the most common one was a big fan of wires sticking up, suspended by another wire, and you would just feed it with a single wire, and you'd ground the other side of your station, and that was the antenna system. And or it was a single wire going up to a T of some sort, with the idea being the length of that wire would be a half wavelength, and that determined the wavelength of operation. So at the time, what you read, if you read the history of this stuff, is that 600 meter wavelength became the best, the wavelength everybody wanted to use. And why? It was because the biggest ships were 300 meters long. And that was the biggest antenna you could put on a ship. Oh, and by the way, Steve, you asked about urban environments. Yeah, of course, you couldn't put up a huge antenna in an urban environment, but I think things were less restrictive at that time, where you could string wires from one building to the next, say, or even, if you look in the early QST at Maxim's own station, right? He lived in sort of a well-to-do area of West Hartford, Connecticut, and his house is still there. You can go on Google Maps and see it. And there's not much land around this house, but yet he put up a couple of big wooden towers to support this big wire at the time. I can only imagine what his neighbors thought.
If you want to go back to the 20s about some of the early amateur radio stuff, there's an article, I think in September 27 or so, I forget, QST, called Ethereal Adornments. The article was written by Lauren G. Wyndham. It was the origins of the off-center fed Wyndham antenna.
Hey, by the way, speaking of antennas named after people, right? We've all used Beverage antennas, right? They're named after a guy named Harold Beverage. And this is another part of this transatlantic test story that, we're revisiting this year in the centennial, because when this guy Godley was sent over to the UK to operate, by coincidence, Beverage was on the same ship. And they recognized each other and got together for a handshake. And it was completely coincidence. And Godley ended up using a Beverage wire for that receiving setup.
One bit of Chris, I just for your information, I used to be a member of a club that was established in 1917. It was known as 9YB, which became W9YC, which became W0YC.
One of the indications that it was an early station was that in the very early days, the FCC issued special call signs to amateurs who were permitted to operate above 200 meters. In other words, at longer wavelengths by special authority. And they were given call signs whose suffix ended in either Y or Z, or sometimes X. And so any of those call signs you see that are 1x2s today, if they're old, right? Like in the case of a club, and has a Y or an X or something, dates back to that time. W9YB, I think, is still in operation at, if I'm not mistaken, at Purdue, and they were one of those original stations. W6YX at Stanford was one of those original ones. W1MX at MIT was originally 1XM, one of those original stations. There are a number of them.
So Chris, what was what was the spark that got you interested in all of the history? I mean, you're an engineer, work on quantum computers, like obviously you're an amateur radio operator, but where'd the history bug come from?
I don't know. I sort of got interested. I started poking around at the early issues of QST and just got fascinated by it. Part of it is you read those early issues and it's like a different language almost, the way they talked about radio and stuff. And it just drew me in. I started, reading more and more and writing about it.
Have you written a book, or have you thought about putting this story you just told in a book?
Yeah, I thought about that, but I had second thoughts. I wasn't sure I could put in all the time required to actually write a book. So I opted to write this blog that, I showed you that web page as installments. And I had a few of my friends, proofread the articles. And I did that for a few years until I got too busy to continue. And so it takes you up till about 1930.
Well, once again, Chris, let me just extend a great thanks from the club for the terrific presentation. I am going to say I'm going to personally say 7-3 because I got to move on. I really appreciate you spending the time with us, though. It's been really, really great.
My pleasure. 7-3, everybody.
7-3.